Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Nikhil Buduma, co-founder and chief scientist at Ambience Healthcare. Nikhil, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Nikhil, what I always like to do before getting into the main part of the conversation is to give my guest a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Nikhil, the floor is yours.
Of course. It's great to be here. I'm the co-founder and chief scientist of Ambience Healthcare, which is an AI company that's building a platform to support clinicians. It's a piece of technology that is embedded inside of the EHR, and it supports clinicians before, during, and after every single one of their interactions with their patient. And the goal is to automate sort of the range of administrative tasks that normally would distract a clinician from being able to build authentic relationships and focus on delivering care. So that includes, how do you prepare for a visit? It includes documenting that visit. It includes communications with patients and their providers after the visit. And the goal is really to sort of liberate clinicians from the administrative burden so they can focus on what they do best, which is taking care of their patients.
It's definitely going to be a lot to dive into from that perspective. One other question I'm always interested in before we get to that, though, is, how did you get into healthcare in the first place?
Oh, man. In some ways, healthcare is near and dear to my heart. My family had sort of immigrated from rural India, and when I was born, they didn't have traditional insurance. My dad was an intern, and so we went through the sort of messy journey through the healthcare system. I had several heart defects. I had sepsis several times before I turned 10, so I was constantly inside of the healthcare system. I originally actually thought that I was going to be a physician, and so I was on this traditional academic clinical path. I was out in Boston and for school, and interestingly enough, I happened to be doing a lot of work very early on, sort of in that first wave of AI and machine learning. I don't know if you remember when the world was obsessed with computer vision and self-driving cars, and it felt like in 2012 and 2013, all of that might be imminently solved. But I was writing a lot about sort of those early deep learning AI techniques during that time, ended up connecting with Sam Altman and what ultimately became the early OpenAI team. I actually also met my co-founder, Mike, when I was out in Boston. He had actually fractured his back and was sort of navigating the messiness of the healthcare system himself. And so when we met, we just had this really deep sort of fervor for healthcare, and just felt like this new class of AI technologies was going to have a pretty significant impact on the way we work in general, but very specifically in healthcare, that it could be a huge unlock. And so, we were both sort of immersed in this early world of AI, and we just had this itch that we wanted to sort of bring these technologies into healthcare. And so Mike and I started our first company together in 2015. We actually ran a care delivery organization. So we were hiring clinicians, we were implementing EHR, we raised venture capital to build technology in the workflow for our clinicians. We were working with payers, specifically a D-SNP plan in the South Florida market. And so we just built this incredibly deep appreciation for all of the things it took to operate a health system. And then we were in the trenches with our clinicians. We saw the visceral pain of how much time they were spending inside of the EHR. We saw the visceral pain of not being able to go home and spend time with their family and their loved ones. In many ways, that sort of set the context for ultimately coming to build Ambience, which we started in 2020. That's sort of been the journey of how we ended up in healthcare and how we ended up working on this specific problem.
That sounds like an incredible journey where, as you said, you had a lot of immediate and deep understanding and connection and interaction with a lot of the issues. So one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is you said, in that first wave of AI, it sounds like kind of in the early, late aughts, if that's still the way that's referred to, you kind of saw this promise in the way that AI could evolve to help healthcare. What in particular did you see, and like how did how did you capture that vision?
The history of AI over the last 2 decades or so is very interesting. I think in the very early sort of 2012 and 2013, there was a lot of promise. The idea was anything that you could describe as a clear task where you could construct, here's the input, here's what I want the model to do, here's an example of an output. If I could generate a data set of many of these instances, I could build an algorithm that could essentially automate it. And one of the theses behind organizations like OpenAI and others was that we could actually build these general purpose algorithms that could automate tasks that traditionally we would require human intelligence to do. There was a very big inflection point around 2017. There was this invention of a new architecture called the transformer. And I think you think about OpenAI's history, there was actually a pretty significant transition pre versus post transformers, in that this was the first architecture that was sort of unlocked where these models actually had the ability to scale across multiple types of tasks if you train them on large data sets taken from the internet. It's very interesting that you train these models to sort of ingest large amounts of text, you have them predict the next word, and all of a sudden you have these incredible emergent properties sort of fall out of these models where they can start to do things that you would normally ascribe to human intelligence. And I think you coupled that with sort of this discovery, what's called neural scaling laws. So as you made these models bigger and bigger, these models became increasingly more capable, and there didn't seem to be sort of an end in sight, as long as you can continue throwing more data and more compute into these models. And so the way we started to think about leveraging these techniques was starting to look at what are all the tasks that clinicians were actually doing in the workflow. So from our experience, about a third of our clinicians' time was spent hands-on patient. 2/3 was basically everything else. You could think about what were they doing before the visit, which was they were looking through the chart, trying to catch up on what exactly is this patient here for? What are all the problems that they have? How do I want to prioritize those problems? Because I've got limited time in the visit, and I need to know how to use that time effectively. Then I'm in the conversation. I'm talking to this person. I might be stepping out and looking it up to date to try to catch up on, figure out what's the right evidence-based guideline to take care of this particular patient. I might be multitasking, typing inside of the EHR, trying to complete documentation, complete labs. And then that patient walks out of the room, and all of a sudden, there's a whole sort of range of additional administrative tasks that are on my plate. I've got to code this visit appropriately, select the right ICD-10 codes, the right CPT codes. I've got to think about which orders might need prior auth, and think about what do I need to write my documentation to satisfy prior auth. I might have to refer this patient to a specialist. I might have to write a summary for them and their family in an after-visit summary. There's all this work that was happening. And so we started to sort of build these models, bespoke models, to try to address more and more of these tasks in the clinical workflow. When we were building some of this technology at our previous company, the reality is we were limited in what the technology could do. I think we were working on models that had millions, tens of millions of parameters, nothing like the models we have today that are, billions, if not trillions of parameters. And so there was hard technical limitations to what we could do. And so, fast forward to 2020, I think a big thesis behind the company was if we could build the most capable clinical reasoning models in existence and then tackle those same workflows, we could actually dramatically increase the time clinicians spent with their patients. That's sort of how we thought about these technologies.
So kind of as you're talking about your thinking around what the technologies could do and enable, can you better, or not maybe not better, but can you just dive a little bit deeper into how the evolution of the technology enabled you to get to the place where it could actually function the way that you're envisioning? Because it's, I know you just referenced the, kind of that vast, exponential growth and kind of the parameters that you could utilize. What enabled that? And then what goes into then building around that, given what you're working at, kind of all the different, layers that you're always working with when you're in healthcare.
Yeah. When we started the company in 2020, there was two very core theses that sort of drove how we built Ambience. We came from sort of the health system operations world, and we knew we were trying to build technology for health systems. I think the first sort of key insight that was top of mind for us is if you think about a health system, they're home to dozens and dozens of different specialty areas. Primary care, cardiology, nephrology, oncology, and that's just in the outpatient setting. You go into acute care, then you've got the emergency department, then you've got the inpatient setting. The challenge with supporting sort of this wide range of workflows is that every clinician has almost a completely different job. They have different medicine that they're practicing. Their workflows inside of the EHR might be different. And there's different sort of administrative sort of coding and billing, prior auth, and other kinds of rules that sort of dictate how they do their work. And so if we wanted to build technology that could effectively take that burden off of clinicians, we had to build sort of a set of products that could address the unique and bespoke needs of every single one of those specialties. And so when we started the company, we basically decided that this isn't one product that we're building, right? It's not an AI scribe. When people talk about an AI scribe, what they mean is something listening to the conversation and writing documentation. We're thinking about something much bigger in the workflow, which is what are all the tasks from pre-charting to documentation to orders to clinical decision support to after-visit summaries that the clinician has to focus on. But then more specifically beyond that is how do those workflows look different as you move from one specialty to another, as you move from primary care to oncology to the ED to the inpatient setting. What's funny is if you think about how we would do this task as a human, right? If you happen to have a scribe and they were trained to perform really, really well in primary care, and then all of a sudden one week you told them, you have to go into the oncology ward this week, how likely would that person be to be successful in that setting? Probably not very. And then if they're probably in that conversation, they're like, what's a stage 3 tumor board? I have no idea, why, what is this care pathway? What are the next steps? And if this care pathway is not working, what are the alternatives? It's like a set of knowledge and workflows that's just completely absent from the training of a primary care scribe. And then if you drop that person into an ED, then that person is going to be completely lost in the emergency department because the workflows are just completely different. In fact, you think about a primary care visit, it's a one-to-one interaction, you have one piece of documentation, you move on to the next patient. In the ED, you've got a paramedic coming in, you've got multiple patients you're balancing at the same time. You have to produce intermediate documentation in the ED course in the EHR, which looks completely different from the primary care workflow in the EHR. And then you might have to be collaborating with other specialists in order to complete your documentation and make decisions around whether you're going to discharge this patient to the community or actually admit them into the hospital. So you can kind of imagine if you built an AI product for a primary care physician and then you gave it to the oncologist or you gave it to the ED physician, it might be practically unusable. And so the core sort of foundation of Ambience is recognizing that yes, we've got these sort of really powerful general purpose models, and we're going to imbue these models with incredibly powerful clinical intelligence at Ambience. But we need the infrastructure to build, launch, monitor, maintain, and continuously improve 50 plus different AI products to serve as a health system, not just one. And so that's sort of the core DNA with which we started Ambience.
Intuitively, that makes a lot of sense because as you're saying, not only does each clinician practice differently, but every specialty, as you kept pointing out, is seeing different issues and having different workflows. So it's trying to do a one-size-fit-all approach is just going to be very difficult. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Nikhil Buduma from Ambience Healthcare, talking about challenges of AI and opportunities of AI. So kind of with everything that you've been talking about, Nikhil, I feel like there's always that kind of the overarching question, or at least maybe this is just where my mind goes, is given all those different models that you're working on and, developing and training, what goes into trying to help contain, the hallucinations or the other, kind of questions that you might have of how do I know that I can trust the accuracy and, be able to know that that the tool that I'm using is reliable?
It's a great question. I think it's top of mind for us because healthcare happens to be a place where safety is paramount, compliance is table stakes. And trust is one of those things where it takes years to build and just a moment to lose. And so this is incredibly top of mind for us. One of the core pieces of infrastructure that we've built internally is sort of like a quality engine. And this is a complex piece of infrastructure to build because if you're trying to deploy software that's supporting a number of different workflows, as well as 50 plus different specialty areas, including the ED and the inpatient setting, you can almost envisage like sort of the scale of surface area that we have to cover. Part of the reason why we're sort of in the position that we're in right now is we spent the last 4 years working specifically on this set of problems and on this specific technology. And so we've had an opportunity to collaborate very closely with a number of health systems, including leading academic medical centers, to actually build out sort of what we call these evals, which is a robust set of test cases that allow us to understand how effectively are our models performing on every task in the wild that they would be expected to be able to handle across all of the settings of care that they would be deployed in. And that quality engine is almost like our internal quality control that's constantly running every time we're training, shipping, releasing a new model. And anytime we run into an edge case in the wild that we didn't expect and wasn't necessarily part of that initial quality control, we have an operational loop to collaborate with our health system partners to then include those examples back into our evaluation set so we can continue to improve that sort of quality control engine over time. But for us, that's critical because, you think about from a clinical perspective, these models have to be reflecting the true clinical reality of what's happening in the visit. But the other piece, which we haven't really talked about yet and probably should, is these technologies also are going to be used to support decisions around coding and prior auth. And that's a place where compliance is paramount, and mistakes around compliance can be extremely, extremely expensive if you don't get it right.
Well, since you opened the door over onto the compliance side, what are the specific challenges? And, as you mentioned, prior auth, if you get it wrong, arguably have an impact because you're going to potentially delay care or, make it a claim rejected until you can get it fixed. Coding, if you get it wrong, I think as you're kind of implying, you're implicitly saying that could have significant down the road ramifications if it's determined that the coding was an error and the clinician received more payment than arguably should have been received. So, what are the challenges that you've encountered on that, on that side of the house, and kind of what backup do you provide? Because it's I could see hesitancy potentially to use an automated solution because the user might say, well, if it gets it wrong, who's going to be responsible for it?
Mm-hmm. I think you bring up a couple of really good points. From our experience, if you take a step back and you ask, there's a lot of excitement right now in the broader ecosystem around AI. And we ask well, let's put that excitement aside. As most organizations are bringing technologies into clinic, what are they materially seeing? And I think there's actually two things that is very surprising for most folks, pre versus post trying to use an AI scribe. The first is related to what we talked about earlier, which is you think this would work for all your clinicians, and for the vast majority of organizations working with some of the technology vendors out there, they realize I kind of see some adoption in primary care and primary care adjacent specialties, but there's a massive drop off for my specialists and subspecialists, and there's almost no solution at all for ED and the inpatient docs, and you can imagine that accounts for the vast majority of the revenue coming into the health system. The second piece, which is what we're getting to now, is most organizations are, they started off by thinking about documentation as sort of for the clinician, which is absolutely true. But the result is when you only evaluate the needs of the clinician, you forget all the other uses of documentation. And as you brought up sort of insightfully, documentation is not just for continuity of care, it's also to support coding and prior auth. And in the situations where those stakeholders weren't part of the evaluation set. There's a lot of organizations who are starting to realize I implemented technology and all of a sudden my downstream metrics don't look so good. My CDI query rates are going up. My denial rates are going up. My billings per chart are going down. And it's almost like it's prompting a new conversation in the industry, because obviously it's a challenge if you're solving a problem for the clinician, but you're also creating problems for the enterprise and problems for all sorts of other teams. Our perspective has been that you can't actually think about documentation and coding and documentation and prior auth as different problems. They're two sides of the same coin. And we kind of address that in the workflow. So when the clinician's talking to the patient, we're actually helping the clinician actively in the workflow construct a more accurate representation of what's actually happening in the clinic. And so, for instance, if we're missing information that we think is important to close the gap on, we actually surface that question to the clinician while they're in the workflow to help them build a better source of truth. And then when we write documentation, we actually think about what is the contract type, who's the payer, and what are they expecting in documentation to actually support those codes. And it's almost like a tale of two cities. If you get it right, then you can almost imagine the average clinician, if they didn't go to school to write documentation, they sure as hell didn't go to school to learn all the thousands of coding and billing rules that change year over year and change by specialty, change by payer. And so this is a huge opportunity to help upskill the average clinician's accuracy and compliance. And it turns out there's a lot of downstream opportunity in that. Or you put in a solution that doesn't understand those rules and it makes all the downstream metrics worse. The way we think about it is in the same way that you would have evals in your quality engine around clinical accuracy, you need to have evals in your quality engine around coding accuracy. And part of that is you have to work with the regulatory bodies. So you think about groups like AHIMA and the American Association of Professional Coders. We actually have worked with them from the ground up to figure out what are the coding requirements by contract type, by specialty. How do we make sure that those edge cases are represented in our quality engine? And when we work with a health system, we actually have a continuous auditing program where we actually pay for auditing resources to continuously take samples of charts and actually give us feedback to us and the health system on how well did we do, how well was the health system doing before Ambience came in, and what did the metrics look like post-Ambience. And that continuous loop actually helps build a lot of shared confidence, both with the regulators, for us internally as Ambience, as well as for our health system partners. So that's how we kind of think about making this work.
Yeah, and it also seems like taking kind of that holistic approach that you're talking about, likely produces a better note or better documentation at the end of the day, because it could be, we see you're going in this direction that would support this coding, but you're missing this information, which would then be, potentially important information to make sure is written down from the clinical perspective as well, because now you're making, you're seeing kind of that complete picture that keeps carrying forward. So it definitely sounds like it's, supporting and driving, more thoughtful documentation and, more thoughtful, approach to presentation of information.
100%. In some ways, we lament that it's hard to trust the data inside of the EHR. And that creates complications for all sorts of downstream initiatives. But the crux of the issue is the reason we're there is because we've turned clinicians, who are these incredibly high-skilled people who want to take care of people, into manual data entry specialists. And we've also overloaded this sort of documentation into being something that's not just for them, but for all sorts of downstream purposes that they have no expertise in, nor do they have any interest in building expertise in. And so I think this is a beautiful moment in time where we have an opportunity to use this technology to liberate clinicians from this sort of administrative burden, but also to distill the expertise of all these other functional areas and bring them to the point of care, so we can also alleviate not just the typing burden, but also the cognitive burden of think about these things for the clinician.
No, I think that's a great point and a great way to synthesize it. And Nikhil, believe it or not, we're already almost out of time. So I'm going to close with one final question, which is, what one thing has you most excited about, the impact that AI is going to have on healthcare in the next couple of years?
I think the realization that is surprising to me is that there are a large number of health systems who are starting to buy into this bigger idea that AI is going to fundamentally change the way that they operate as organizations. And they're starting to think about, what are the core infrastructure investments that I can make as an organization? In the same way that we had this core infrastructure investment in the EHR 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to go from paper to digital, what's the core infrastructural investment that I have to make to unlock my organization's AI clock speed so I can rapidly test, evaluate, and implement those opportunities that are going to sort of unlock new opportunities for my organization? I think that's probably the most exciting part, is we have this like very clear buy-in from organizations who are starting to really lean in. And so my guess is we're going to see a rate of change in our industry over the next 2 to 3 years, unlike anything we've ever seen before, which is, to me, very exciting.
No, and I think that'll be great to watch. And as I said, unfortunately, we are already out of time. So I want to thank my guest, Nikhil Buduma, for a great conversation today.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.